I sold the house, got a divorce, and took everything back after my cruel husband made fun of our son's cancer and threw juice on him. Suddenly, my 9-year-old son, Nick, was diagnosed with pediatric cancer. Nick had been complaining of constant fatigue, but I never thought it was just ordinary fatigue. Pediatric cancer was the last thing on my mind that day, and he had to be admitted to the hospital for difficult treatments because he was being lazy, right? How attention-seeking can you be to try to win sympathy for something as ridiculous as pediatric cancer? Even when I told Michael about Nick's condition, he didn't take it seriously because he was too busy at work. He never once paid Nick a visit in the hospital, and my mother-in-law, Susan, who insisted that the wife should take care of the house, never did anything to help and only grumbled. Then one day, Susan and Michael, who had never visited before, came to Nick's hospital room. He took the orange juice Nick was drinking and threw it over his head, saying, "I'm going on a week-long spa trip with your grandma. Make sure you're cured by the time I return." Excuse me, but I found a lot of stories online about miraculous cancer cures with vitamins, such as stage 4 cancer disappearing in a week. A week later, I thought back on my past and realized that I had married my first husband, David, when I was 26 years old. He was 4 years older than me, and I was in utter shock. Nick broke down in tears after they left, relieved from the fear that he was curing cancer with vitamins. "What the devil is he doing? Throwing liquid on a sick person?" had been my tutor during my high school preparation. After I started working, we reconnected as co-workers, and we gradually moved from reminiscing to discussing the future and getting married. That is the background of the situation. Nick was born the following year, right before our new family started its journey, and David passed away the following year from illness. He had felt exhausted, but he chose not to seek medical attention because of his job. When he collapsed at work one day, it was found that he had cancer. He began treatment right away, but the illness spread quickly, and he died 3 months later. Years later, I remarried my current husband, Michael. At first, I was concerned about how Nick and Michael, who were not blood relatives, would get along, but they grew closer over time. And one day Nick asked if he could call Michael Dad, which shocked Michael. Michael and I exchanged glances, but we knew this was our solution and took marriage seriously. Our meeting with Michael's parents went well, and they loved Nick as their own grandchild. Since this was Michael's first marriage, we invited close friends and family for a wedding ceremony. I joked with my friends that it was a touching ceremony, but the apparently content in-law family had its problems. My mother-in-law Susan seemed to be at odds with my brother-in-law's wife, Alice, and she constantly complained about her. Michael's younger brother Hugh married before us, and when he started working, marriage was unthinkable. It seemed to be his favorite saying. His serious brother-in-law chose to take over his parents-in-law's family, got married, and lived with them in the in-laws' home. I mostly nodded along and ignored her tirades as she entered the conversation, which made me uncomfortable because I didn't want to take sides based solely on her complaints, and I didn't feel comfortable asking Alice about it. However, this seemed to encourage her to encroach more and more on our home. She began staying over for a variety of reasons, and before I knew it, she was staying over half the month and eventually moving in with her belongings. She started behaving as though she owned the place, and her attitude toward Nick and me changed. Initially, my mother-in-law was understanding and kind to me and my son, but she started saying sarcastic things that didn't matter to us prior to getting married. I was working part-time to make ends meet with David's estate, and even after getting married, I kept working part-time, albeit less frequently, to help out a little bit. More money is always preferable when thinking about Nick's future, but Susan implied that Michael wasn't making enough money from my part-time job and kept telling me to quit because you're a mother and should put parenting first. I've never neglected Nick because of my job. We've managed just fine together. However, Susan then began making crude comments to Nick, saying things like, "You're the reason your mum struggles. Your new dad even feels it. Embarrassed about you in public." She accused Nick of making Michael feel uneasy and began making him complete middle school-level workbooks that were too difficult for a child in lower elementary school. He hadn't even learned the fundamentals. Nick, of course, was unable to respond to any questions and ended up crying. So, she would even take away his food. claiming that his sobbing was bothersome. And that boys, what kind of parenting is this? She said it so that my son could hear her, so my son would frequently say sorry and apologize to me. It must have been difficult for him that I was being blamed because of him. Nick eventually started to avoid being alone with her and became afraid of her. What an unlovable brat he is. He lacks cuteness because he doesn't get enough motherly love. Out on Nick, so I gradually lost the ability to express my opinions. However, I couldn't keep quiet for Nick's sake, so I waited for Michael, who was frequently away at work, to return home before telling him everything about Susan's behavior. However, he didn't believe me when I insisted that his mother couldn't possibly say such things or treat a child badly. You say that my mom is awful, but perhaps you're the one treating her harshly, based on the complaints I've heard. I had been told to quit my job, but I had never forced housework onto Susan. In fact, I had never seen her do any housework. Instead, she sat around like the lady of the house, ordering me around, complaining about the seasoning of meals, but I had never had a chance to taste her preferred method. You can't handle the housework properly since we can live on my income. Just focus on the house and stop working outside. Adding seasoning. How could I guess flavors I've never tried? I'm not a mind reader, and I almost spoke back several times, but I always held back out of fear that Nick would become her target. Gradually, Michael's attitude toward Nick and me grew colder, but it was still bearable at times. He never hit us, but he would throw things occasionally, hitting Nick once when Nick cried out. Michael dragged him outside in pain and fear, telling him to stay there until he stopped crying. I protected Nick, ready to be hit, but fortunately Michael lost interest. Perhaps it was a turn-off. He must be under stress from work. I assumed that if he calmed down, he would return to his kind self. I chose to endure, ready to keep Nick safe, but it wasn't easy during these unresolved issues with Susan and Michael. Nick turned 9 years old, loved basketball, and began going to a clinic run by an amateur basketball team. He seemed much happier because he had something to focus on and was spending less time with Susan. However, one day he started feeling ill. I assumed he had overdone it with basketball and let him rest, but after a week, it seemed to get worse. So I took him to the pediatrician we'd always trusted, and they recommended that we get more extensive testing done, and I had no idea about large hospitals. My only experience was that the doctor who treated David had contacts and wrote a referral for us, telling me to get a medical consultation as soon as possible, preferably by tomorrow. I was relieved to see a familiar doctor first, but I was also afraid Nick might be seriously ill, so I asked Michael if he could accompany us. I've heard of children using illness as a form of rebellion against their parents, but would a child fabricate being ill to the extent of not eating well and continuing it for a week? Even adults find it difficult to fast for a week. He declined, so it's likely just him acting. Did something happen at school? If you believe everything a child says, no amount of money will ever be enough. Big hospitals are expensive, so pay for it with your part-time income. It takes extraordinary determination to make a statement. But in any case, Nick's illness lasting a week meant that something was wrong. I had no problem using my part-time income to pay for it, and I told Michael that I would take Nick to the hospital by myself. He simply replied, "Do whatever you want," and was clearly upset that night. The following day, the hospital was ready for the worst-case scenario. When I asked the doctor what that meant, they explained that the symptoms of pediatric cancer can be likened to a cold, such as sudden weight loss or abdominal pain. They also asked me if I had noticed anything out of the ordinary, and Nick disclosed that he had been experiencing joint pain. When I asked him why he hadn't mentioned it, he said that he didn't want to cause me further anxiety or expose me to hurtful remarks from Michael and Susan. I felt awful that he was. As I considered my shortcomings, I realized that Nick's illness was an early symptom of pediatric cancer, which required him to be hospitalized. As I prepared for his stay, I told Michael and Susan that pediatric cancer is a worthless burden that costs a fortune. Nick was in pain but worried about me. Perhaps if I had handled things better with Michael and Susan, I would have noticed the signs of Nick's discomfort earlier. Won't pay a dime for cancer's hereditary right. David died of cancer, didn't he? Thank you for leaving such a wonderful legacy. Michael added coldly. Their heartlessness was unfathomable. Susan complained only about the cost of cancer treatments, which can be very costly. Michael even told me in front of me that the costs would be deducted from my part-time income. I couldn't stand being around these idiots any longer. I hurried to the hospital where Nick was waiting. Nick had to give up basketball, which he loved, and his fun school life in order to concentrate on his treatment. Luckily, the pediatric ward had a school so he wouldn't fall behind in his studies, but it shocked him to see other kids in much worse conditions. Will I end up like them? I wanted to be a famous basketball player. It was stated that a patient's mental state can affect their condition, so I was advised to avoid making him feel like a burden. I have never placed blame on him, but perhaps my worry revealed that I may have unintentionally given off an air of anxiety that he detected. I decided to lift my spirits and support Nick, who was growing more and more depressed. I believed I understood the difficulties of cancer treatment from David's experience, but he hadn't received extensive treatment. In fact, I only knew you could say anything with words. At times, he cried out, wishing to die rather than get better, and the side effects were so excruciating that they seemed to be unbearable. They say even adults find some cancer treatments difficult to the point where they feel like giving up. In order to genuinely support Nick, I looked for opportunities to speak with people who had gone through similar experiences. We were brought to a college hospital where I met a student who had survived pediatric cancer, listened to their story and asked them what words made them happy, what words made them sad, and what they wished to hear. Despite our difficulties, neither Michael. When I went home to get Nick's clothes, Michael said, "Aren't you my wife? Why are you neglecting our home to do this?" The few times he spoke to me were only to chastise me for putting Nick before myself. Neither Susan nor Nick visited, to be honest, as their presence would probably depress us, so their absence was preferable. Being a good wife, whether at home or in the hospital, meant that I was never at ease. I was always on edge and barely managed to get by on my own strength. In the midst of all of this, my father-in-law, Bob, was the only one who regularly visited us. His attention to Nick and me, along with our light-hearted chats, helped us temporarily forget the harsh reality, for which I am incredibly grateful. It was also a pleasure to see Bob. I wish that Michael and Susan, my roommates, could have even a fraction of Bob's compassion. Nick, who usually seemed uninterested, would smile more whenever his grandfather came to visit. Bob once confided in me that he had lost a close friend to cancer, having seen a burden on the living family, and his friends struggle with harsh treatments. He expressed a desire to help us in any way he could. Nevertheless, it hurts more to expect something and then be disappointed, so I gave up hope. One day, Susan and Michael, who had shown no concern for Nick's illness, showed up in his hospital room. "How long do you intend to flee the house like a teenage rebel? The house is a mess because you're not there. A wife has her responsibilities, and when it's time for someone to pass away, they will, so just leave it alone. The cure for cancer is just..." I was so angry and dumbfounded that I lost all reason. There are things you should and shouldn't say, right? There is a time and place for everything, isn't there? Haven't you lived a lot longer than Nick? Cure for cancer, anyway. Everyone dies eventually. What are those words to say in a ward where many are trying to recover? They're always this disgusting. I know that sometimes brain tumors can cause personality changes, so perhaps you too should get a brain scan. I vaguely remembered a medical drama with a similar plot, but I said it confidently in the hopes of frightening them a little. "You're insulting the mother who reared me, Nick, who became ill with cancer due to your poor parenting, right? I read online that cancer can be cured instantly by taking vitamins." Michael grabbed Nick's half-finished orange juice and poured it over his head. It was such an unexpected move that I was powerless to stop it. Nick and I were left speechless, and Michael and Susan pointed and laughed at us. "I'm going on a trip with Mom, so if your stupid son's illness isn't cured by the time we get back, who knows what we'll do. Keep that in mind and make sure you clean the house." The nurses hurried in upon hearing the commotion, busying themselves with cleaning and changing the sheets, while Nick and I waited in an empty room. The young grandson discovered that Alice had also been mistreated by Susan. He became enraged and lost patience with her. When Susan returned as if nothing had happened, he informed her that they were divorcing. At first, she objected, but eventually agreed, reasoning that it would be better to get alimony than to continue living with an unwanted Alice and a husband who didn't care for her, but in the end, She was the one who had to pay the alimony that Alice demanded because of her mental distress. Michael, who had been temporarily living with Susan, was also expelled from the family home. After Bob learned that they had mistreated me and Nick, Michael and Susan now lived together in a dilapidated apartment, making do with day labor because he finds it difficult to find steady employment. Susan has been off for years. The housewife has refused to work, and they are always fighting and blaming one another. Their loud arguments have even resulted in noise complaints and police warnings. Both are to blame. Susan started the trouble and Michael joined in, but he shares responsibility from the beginning. Susan, on the other hand, seems too thick-skinned and stubborn to be impacted by any fallout after everything was resolved. Bob came to see me and Nick. He expressed his sincere regret for what his wife and son had done, wished us happiness, and discreetly gave me some money as payment. I initially refused, but he persisted in saying that it was the least he could do, because he couldn't be present to watch Nick get better. After I got divorced, Nick felt relieved to be free of his stepfather's control and fear. Grandma and his mood stabilized. The doctor began to record his good health more often, and as he grew more optimistic, setting goals helped him get through difficult treatments without complaining. His efforts paid off, and he was given a temporary discharge because, with continued treatment, his condition further stabilized and he was able to go to school. His school and its students are understanding and supportive, which gives me peace of mind when I send him there. He occasionally needs to be hospitalized, but not for as long as before. He sets small goals for himself, such as things to do or eat after his hospital stays or treatments, focusing on his recovery. Stable healing is free at this time. I'm resolved to progress toward increased contentment with Nick side by side.